Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all of our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. In 2017, Laurie Lee Hall publicly shared her remarkable journey as a transgender Latter-day Saint. It took her through joining the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, serving a 2-year mission, marrying and having children, being called as a bishop and stake president, and becoming head architect for the faith's sacred temples. Transitioning to her authentic self, she said, caused her to lose her job, her marriage, and her church membership. Yet she is more at peace with herself than she ever has been. Hall details the twists and turns her life took as she moved inexorably toward acceptance of her real identity in a new memoir, Dictates of Conscience, From Mormon High Priest to My New Life as a Woman. She joins us virtually from her home in Kentucky. Laurie, welcome.
So glad to be back on Mormon Land again.
Your story has been pretty widely told, even in this paper and on this podcast and many other places. Why write this book?
So that is actually the most important thing I say right at the beginning of the book. I wrote a preface that's entitled, Why Tell My Story Now? And it really comes down to the inspiration I felt and the desperation I was feeling in both the political and the religious climate in which we were living in, even these past couple of years, in which we saw large-scale denial of the reality of gender identity. And I wanted, through writing my memoir, to humanize gender identity, to put a face to it, and to use my story as a vehicle to help others who might need to know and understand, to inform and to educate that gender identity is real, that gender dysphoria is a real medical condition that can be treated with proper gender-affirming health care, and that social transition, medical transition, and even surgical transition at many times is necessary for an individual who experiences gender dysphoria to mitigate the challenges that are faced, which are real, and to be able to go on to live healthy, normal, and thriving lives.
So we interviewed you on this podcast in 2017, and at that time you were living in Utah trying to set up your own architectural firm. So bring our listeners up to date. What happened to your job at the church, and did you get, referrals from your colleagues there?
So my favorite answer in the process of telling my story now is that it's all in the book. And so I encourage those who wish to delve deeper beyond what we're going to be able to cover in the next 30 minutes to take a deep dive into Dictates of Conscience, where I cover the answers to these and many other questions. But the simple story of what occurred was I reached a point where I needed to socially transition and present full-time as Laurie Lee while I was still working for the church in physical facilities. I asked for the opportunity, consistent with state law, that allowed individuals to socially transition while maintaining their employment status, which of course there's an exception for religious employers who don't have to follow that. But I asked the church straight out if I could be treated in the same way that my colleagues in other employment in the state were being treated. Ultimately, I was forced to lose my temple recommend and disqualified from being able to continue to be an employee of the church without that question ever being directly answered. It was ecclesiastically answered, unfortunately, in a very backdoor kind of way. I did, as you mentioned, Peggy, begin to practice architecture privately while still in Utah, but very quickly realized that I didn't have much order reputation in the building community in Utah. And at the same time, and I tell this story as well in the book, I developed a relationship online with a former friend and member of a family that I knew long ago. And situation was that she and I were able to come together and develop a relationship that has turned into a deep and abiding love, which brought me to live here in Kentucky, just outside of Louisville, where I am now. And I'm happy to say that as time has continued on that subject of having my private practice, that I was able to be licensed here in Kentucky and have lots of wonderful little projects going on here, including working for our county, as well as continue to be able to do some projects back in Utah. So time heals with regard to those professional issues. And I enjoy that aspect of my life, continuing to practice as my authentic self.
So, Laura, I'm going to take you back to a more painful time right now, just for our listeners. We'll be curious. When you were excommunicated in 2016, what did leaders tell you was your sin? What did you need to repent of?
That was a very complicated thing for them to try to describe because there wasn't one. And the excommunication took place actually in June of 2017. There was concern that I had attended a single Relief Society meeting for a few minutes in my home ward. There was concern that I was going, that I believed opposite the teachings of the brethren at the time. I was able to explain how my beliefs were, in my mind, were consistent with the teachings of the brethren. And I also demonstrated that I was not an apostate attempting to convince others to believe as I believed, since, of course, my experience with gender identity was a very personal issue. And although I did have many active LDS friends who also were experiencing gender dysphoria, I certainly wasn't trying to promulgate an alternate doctrine. I believed in the notion that gender is an eternal characteristic of who we are. I still believe that, not the way that it's currently being taught, but current teachings have, I think, varied from what they were in 2017.
And what the Family Proclamation, as you view it, actually says, right?
Yeah, and said going back to 1995, certainly 22 years into its existence, I had studied the heck out of it and believed that it spoke to me very directly about who I was eternally. So anyway, the bottom line was there was no particular sin identified, and it was simply, in my mind, and from what I can tell, having talked with others who participated in all of that, it was the church headquarters directed removal of me, disassociation of me from the name of the church to protect them from whatever threat I might have been.
Obviously, it had great impact, but how did that removal from church affect your life and change it?
Well, it was something I grieved. I had to come to terms, and I think when I first interviewed with Mormon Land, I was still very much processing, the raw feelings that I felt. But one of the subtle natures of the title of Dictates of Conscience, and I do explain this in the book, was that I had told the assembled disciplinary council that my fondest desire was to be able to worship God according to the dictates of my conscience. And I discovered after the excommunication that being freed from doctrinal and policy constraints, being now not a member of the LDS Church, I truly was freed to worship God according to the dictates of my conscience, which I don't think was their intention, but it certainly benefited me to be able to then take responsibility for my beliefs, my faith, and my actions going forward in a way that had integrity to the way that I felt both about myself and the way that I felt about deity and my relationship with deity, with the ministry of the Holy Ghost, etc. There was a negative impact in our family of my excommunication, which I think was the primary driver, not my transition, but the loss of my church membership was the primary driver to the separation initially and ultimately the divorce that ended our marriage of 32 years at the time. And I once sat in a meeting with Church Public Affairs when I was in the presidency of affirmation and explained to them that that was the case, and was it really worth the harm they caused to a family to so-called protect the good name of the church by causing that to happen?
It's because your wife felt devastated that your sealing was canceled, and
right. The church,
that very movingly in the book.
The church that she deeply believed in did nothing to support or prepare her for her spouse losing membership. And I think it's very clear for me looking at it that, that she was harmed by that action against me.
So you write in the book that after you transitioned, women treated you differently than men.
It's been very obvious, became even more obvious as I recounted story after story through the course of the narrative. And this is something my editor, Barbara Jones Brown at Signature Books, picked up on as well, that there's really a vast difference in the way Latter-day Saint women, my sisters at the time, treated me and accepted me in comparison to the way Latter-day Saint men, I think, generally could not accept what I was doing, couldn't bring themselves to seek to understand, with a few exceptions, and recoiled from relationships with me. And over again, I find ways to describe that that's the case. I didn't mean to press that issue until the narrative just took me there. But it seems that I was welcomed by sisters with open arms generally, and shunned generally by the brethren.
So, Laurie, there are heroes in your journey, for lack of a better word, members or those who accepted you as your authentic self. Can you talk about those people?
Well, kind of piggybacking off of what we just talked about, I did have a couple of bishops, one at the time of my excommunication, and then one shortly after, when I attempted to find a safe place to continue to attend worship services, who were great bishops and really lived the spirit of their callings. They were about the sum total of men with Christian hearts. There were lots of Relief Society presidents and other sisters who, as I mentioned, were willing to even sit down with me and teach me how to do makeup. It's just, there's certain things that are so incredibly simple and kind and compassionate that make the journey of social transition so much easier, so much more friendly. And I think that one of the reasons why I tell the story of the Liberty Ward in Salt Lake Liberty Stake And quite frankly, that chapter has been one of the chapters that has been most spoken about by my readers as resonating with them as a powerful explanation of how good the church could be if it chose to be. And I had that wonderful little 10-month experience where the true love of Christ was manifest so frequently in welcoming me, a non-member at that point, be a full and active and participating and serving part of their church community, of their ward family. And I think that story as a bright light of hope in the midst of a whole bunch of turmoil that I was experiencing in other areas, is there on purpose, because I wanted Dictates of Conscience to ultimately be a story of hope that we can, despite our struggles and the challenges we face, come out on the other side. And I say that Dictates of Conscience has a happy ending because I'm still here and I'm thriving. Well, I want to be able to say that to everyone. And I've really been impressed how many people who aren't transgender, who don't have a transgender loved one, or even an LGBTQ loved one, whether they have disabilities or struggles with their faith or whatever their circumstances may be, are writing back to me saying, your story resonates with me and gives me hope because here's how I relate it to my situation. And I've been profoundly grateful for that, because one can only hope as a writer to convey a story and that it might reach some and change hearts, but it's changing lives. And that suggests that the story is powerful enough to have universal appeal.
I read Jana Reese's In Religion News Service interview with you after the book came out. You detail after your gender became public knowledge, and you were giving a construction update to what was then the First Presidency, and I was moved by an exchange you had with Apostle Dieter Uchtdorf. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, he was second counselor in the First Presidency at the time, and I had been coming to meet with the First Presidency on a monthly basis about 5 years at that point, when the First Presidency became aware that I considered myself transgender. This was in the fall of 2012. The first Presidency meeting I had with them after I became known to them as transgender, President Uchtdorf came into the room and had the opportunity to just go around the table and go to his seat. But I was the only person in the room at the time. He entered. He went around the table the opposite way intentionally so that he could greet me, which was out of the norm. He put his arms around me, drew me close into him, and gave me just a powerful hug, whispering in my ear, "We are so grateful that you are here with us." And I melted into his arms in a puddle of tears because of the personal joy and the personal message he was sending. Granted, at the time, I was still pretending to present as male and still walking the line of obedience and so forth, but I was known for who I was, and I was welcome in the role in which I was playing, which was one of the few church employees that had First Presidency contact constantly. I was grateful for that, and that's why I shared that story.
Yeah, Laurie, you designed temples, and you see the church doing all this temple building. Do you ever miss that you're not in on the action right now?
Well, there's a lot of action.
Temples? Yeah,
there's a lot of action. I love the fact that I had those years to be able to do that. There was a point just about a year after that experience I just described to you, when I was taken off of temples and taken out of my contact with the First Presidency. As I explain in the book, I believe directly because of my trans status, and put on to other projects. And I was able to enjoy developing the expansion of the Provo MTC, the Missionary Training Center. So I was eased away from temples as it was. There was a season after my excommunication where I had a hard time even looking at a temple, and it just hurt. My heart ached to be able to even consider that I had been a part of those buildings. But I was able to heal from that through an inspired priesthood blessing. Ultimately, I look at what's being done today with an architecturally critical eye and say, oh, they did okay there, but I would have done better, or I would have done this differently, or there are some problems that they're facing which we knew how to solve in the past, like in Fairview. It's just been there, done that, did some of those things, and grateful for it. Somebody else's turn now.
So let's move on to some of your advocacy. You served as president of Affirmation, LGBTQ support group for Latter-day Saints. Tell us a little bit about that.
Actually, my role was senior vice president. Nathan Kitchen was the president that I served. We had, I was on the board for a year, and then we served together in various capacities in the executive committee of Affirmation for about 4 years after that. Incidentally, Nathan's written all about that in his memoir that he's recently published. I think I have a number of references in his book about our time serving together. But working in Affirmation was a great way to apply myself to my, what I desired as far as an altar of service. It's kind of hard to go from being a constantly involved ecclesiastical leader to suddenly not having an altar of service, someplace where you could contribute to the lives of others. And Affirmation proved to be a great place to be able to not only work with a big worldwide organization and use all that I'd learned about worldwide organizations to be able to contribute to its growth and success, but also to be able to work one-on-one with individuals and, have those meetings in the broom closet where you can sit down and just kind of help an individual to reconcile their identity in their faith, or their identity in their loss of faith, or whatever journey they were on to find joy going forward.
What other advocacy projects have you been involved in?
Writing this book, I suppose, is a big one. This is obviously writing the memoir as a post-Affirmation presidency project. I really devoted most of the last 3 years to the writing and the processing of the trauma and everything associated with this book. I continue to strive to be in interviews like this one, to be responsive in being a voice for the community as things occur, and things are occurring even this week. And I've noticed that members of my community have repeatedly thanked me for being a voice that they felt was in support of themselves. I had the opportunity in 2023 to receive the Paul Mortensen Award in Affirmation. I was the first transgender recipient of that award, which has more than a 40-year history. I continue to be invited to speak in various places. And this summer, recently, I was just told last week that the Mormon History Association has accepted the proposed paper that I'm preparing on gender and Latter-day Saints in the 21st century. So I'll be presenting in the annual conference of the Mormon History Association in Ogden this coming June. I find myself through the publication of Dictates of Conscience and the fact that I was so closely interwoven with the leadership of the church as I experienced these things, that I was working with church leaders before they had formed the policies that they currently have in place, with hopes that I could help them understand and design those policies at one point when I was in a position that I could have been asked and contributed to their understanding. But as it is, I find myself somewhat of a historian now of 21st century gender in the church. Maybe perhaps in the same way that Greg Prince has become something of a voice of the history of homosexuality in the church in the last 40 years.
I want to go to what the church did last year. The church enacted their, frankly, more restrictive policies on transgender members, limiting their callings, saying what classes they can and can't attend, and even advising on restroom use. I know we talked to you about this at the time when they did it. Can you tell a little bit about how you reacted to those changes?
Well, it was an unfortunate thing to have come out as closed as it was, but if there was any bright spot in my experience with that coming out on August 19th of 2024 was that we were right in the middle of writing the afterword for Dictates of Conscience, and we decided that we must respond directly to the church's new policy of restrictions towards its transgender members, or as they put it, individuals who have transitioned socially, medically, or surgically away from their assigned sex at birth, which is an interesting way to describe us. But anyone who's socially transitioned has now to experience everything you just said, David, and more, that there's no opportunity to teach anywhere. Working with children or youth has been prohibited. There are complications for baptism of an investigator who socially transitioned or transitioned away from their biological sex at birth. And this constant reliance upon the words biological sex at birth, that goes back to a conversation, Peggy, you and I had in October of 2019, that you wrote an article about using some of my information where I declared it. When that statement was made by President Oaks, it was a dark day. Well, it's now an even darker day for transgender Latter-day Saints as of August 19th, because these restrictions remove from local priesthood leaders any opportunity to develop flexibility and appropriate responses to the needs of a transgender individual and their family members vis-a-vis their ward members and the participation of that individual and their families. I also point out in this newly rewritten afterword that we created at that point that I fear that a surveillance culture will be developed because many of our youth particularly are exploring styles that would suggest breaking down gender binary restricted presentation and actions that even if they don't consider themselves transgender or genderqueer or gender nonconforming, but they're just working on their personal style, that they're going to be surveilled by certain church members who wish to cause trouble and are using the new restrictions to try to push everyone into one box for the strength level of, elder and sister missionary types of binary presentations. I I even refer in other spaces. 40 years ago, my little sister liked to wear men's dress shirts and skinny ties with her mini skirts when she went to high school. That was just her way of saying what her style was. She's not trans. I'm the one who had in the family who had that opportunity. She was just being her. And I'm afraid that our youth, who are in many ways just being themselves, are going to be targeted inappropriately, that so many innocent people are going to be harmed by such a draconian set of restrictions. But those are strictly based upon the notion that gender, as described in the Family Proclamation, can only be understood in the church as biological sex assigned at birth. And we've seen even this week that the federal government has attempted to do away with the word gender altogether and put its definitions inappropriately upon how we were conceived, which actually isn't scientifically accurate. This, again, going back to our first question, why dictates of conscience? It's the fact that there have to be voices who can say gender identity is real. It's real. It's experienced by a small percentage, but a real percentage of the population. And I'm one of them. And I fought my battles to be able to live according to my gender identity. And it was costly to me. But at the same time, there's absolute joy and safety and security and peace internally to be able to live authentically. And liberty and the pursuit of happiness would suggest that we all have a right to experience that unfettered by controls of religion or government.
Okay, last question, Laurie. And you've just sort of alluded to the peace you feel and in your heart and, freedom. How has your spirituality changed since you transitioned and have had all these experiences? Are you still connected to the church? And if not, I'm not judging. I'm just saying, if not, where does your spirituality lie now?
Fortunately, even right from the beginning, as I began living my life according to the dictates of my conscience, I didn't, and I just honestly don't need institutional religion in order to have a spiritual relationship with deity, with the universe, with God. My little daughter that asked me if I had felt the loss of the Holy Ghost, the answer was an absolute no. I continue to be inspired and prompted in just the same way I was inspired and prompted to write the things that I've written when I wrote them. So my statement to the First Presidency in my letter to them after my excommunication, in which I tried to appeal my case, was that in my current state, which then was also that I was living authentically, I was better prepared to be able to live fully in service and in receiving spiritual blessings and in being able to serve according to spiritual blessings, because I was now finally unfettered by the torture of gender dysphoria. And that's been proven out to be even more the case. Life is good when you're not being tortured by your own demons.
The name of the book is Dictates of Conscience, From Mormon High Priest to My New Life as a Woman. Laurie Lee, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for these thoughtful questions and for the opportunity to have voice again.
Thanks also to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.